how does this whole thing affect generations? Are there differences, similarities between how baby boomers or people from Gen Z are being affected by the whole pandemic? And what does that mean for brands and organizations on how they should respond?
Yeah, good question. Yes, it does affect different generations in different ways. But first of all, I think it's important to mention that every individual is hit in different ways, whether it's financial or physical or mental. So first of all, before we have generations, we are all people with similarities and differences, and everybody is hit in a different way. But when you look from a generational perspective, you also see some differences and also some overlap. And I think to mention the main differences, when you look, for example, at baby boomers, you see that they're less financially impacted compared to the other generations. But of course, there's a big health impact on baby boomers and the silent generation as well, of course, because they are the core group in which COVID has a big health impact. But also, social isolation has a lot of impact on baby boomers. Maybe unexpected, but they're, of course, the least familiar with digital communication, which makes it harder for them to connect with other people socially. But also, we know from research that emotional closeness in relationship increase with age. So therefore, for older generations, it also has a very big effect on their so the social isolation has a big effect. Then, looking from Generation X, well, Generation X, they have a hard time. They have a hard time holding it together because they are taking care of their aging parents, which are in the big impacted group. But they also have children at home, mainly Gen Z. And next to that, they have responsible jobs to take care of. So you see that Generation Xers are really stressed. They really have a hard time by combining all these different roles and responsibilities. And when you look at millennials, well, we know from research on rough economic times that millennials is the generation that is impacted the most financially. So that will have a big influence on millennials again. And millennials are also, well, what we know is that they have, I always call it a bit naive, which is maybe not fair, but that's my generational bias, I think. But they have a naive, optimistic mindset. And what you see now is that because they are quite optimistic generation compared to other generations, is that they are really confronted with another reality. And yeah, I think they will come back a little bit on from this optimistic mindset. And then the last one, Generation Z, I personally think they are hit the hardest. And of course, that's based on the scientific information we have here. Because they're, especially Gen Z in the puberty, I mean, they really have a hard time because they were already a very anxious generation. They're in puberty, which is like that means you're anxious all the time. You're forming your identity. You're insecure all the time, and now the outside world is also insecure. So what we see in all the figures is that their mental well-being is under pressure, high, big time. And again, they are still in their formative years. Generational perspective is based on formative years. And as they are still in the formative years, we're pretty sure that this will have an impact on them for the rest of their lives. Just as environmental issues have a big impact on their formative years as well. So yeah.
How does that relate to? So it has an impact, of course, and I work at your company, so I understand where this whole research is coming from. But what about bouncing back? So we've also seen well, especially in the academic world, not so much in the marketing world, but in the academic world, people are pretty certain that most human beings will fall back on the behavior and needs and most of their values of the pre-COVID era. How does that relate to how generations feel now? So Gen Z feels miserable right now. We see it all over in the news. But yeah, once they can go out again, back to the universities, back to their friends, going on holidays, having a beer in the bar again. What is your expectation about how that for me it feels a bit like Gen Z could be easier for them to bounce back than, for example, being financially affected like a millennial, or being really burned out like a Gen Xer, having to face with stress for a year. That seems that might also have an effect. How do you look at that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you make this nuance because, well, people tend to, well, people don't change that fast and drastically, of course, based on one disruptive event. But when we speak about Generation C, which are still in the formative years, we know from research that that will have a big impact. But what I like of your comment is actually that there's a nuance as well, because we know now that they were already a very anxious generation, and we know already that COVID will have a big impact on them as well, related to their mental well-being. But what's also interesting is that maybe also due to what they experience now makes them more resilient as well. And that's actually the nuance we can add to this, because when I look to my own generation, which is Generation X, they also experienced quite a lot of rough formative years, economically, but also socioculturally, with wars, but there was also this environmental crisis already going on. So they also had really rough formative years. And what you see, what they learned from that, or the characteristic that Generation X had, is that they became very pragmatic. So when the shit hits the fan, so to speak, I would bet on Gen X on surviving. So maybe the same thing can happen to Gen Z as well, and that what they experience now in their formative years, like environmental issues or with COVID, that it makes them resilient on a later age as well. So it's an interesting nuance, yeah. But we don't know it yet because they're still in the formative years.